everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I last joined from a presentation perspective, the marketing research group, probably in 2023 when I launched the social question. And the reason why I mentioned I'm an accidental recruiter is it just wasn't on my bingo card to do recruiting through social media. Also, if you see me start to cry like I am right now, I put in eye drops right before this session, so they're starting to cry their way out. But what I discovered with my social media methodology, where I primarily partner with influencers to host reach outs on Instagram, is that people needed some help with niche recruiting situations or trying to find people that might not exist in panels or in databases or like really specific marketing type profiles. And so while I had experience with recruiting, since I used to be a moderator, right, and I've written screeners, I've reviewed grades, I've helped like coach a recruiter through the type of participant that we needed. This was the first time through owning the social question that I've actually been that recruiting person. So transparently, while these things are kind of aha moments for me, if you are a recruiter, maybe I'm preaching to the choir and these are things that you have been shouting about for years. Hopefully I can get the industry to talk about it in a little bit more context. And then I also want to caveat that a bulk of this conversation is for qualitative recruiting. There's probably pieces that can be taken into consideration or for quant or other types of methodologies, but really thinking about this from a qualitative perspective for the most part. Part of how I came up with this topic to share is I have noticed that relationships and marketing tend to fall into these three different camps. So this has been my perspective. Obviously, our teammate relationships are really highly valued, really highly important because these are the people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. Clients usually come next, depending on your business model. Sometimes the client relationship is a higher priority than your internal teammates, depending on culture. And then you also have your vendors and your suppliers, which is where the recruiters potentially might be, or other types of research data collection or methodologies or just tools and services that you might use. But I just noticed all of these are usually transactional relationships, and they can be measured in slightly different ways, right? So for your internal teammates, it's all about your company's culture. It can manifest in things like your teamwork or your meetings, and then even things like your performance reviews and what your peers say about you and how that fosters or hinders a potential relationship. With clients, obviously the outreach dialogue conversations that you have with them, the contracts that you sign and how things are worded, and then when you're wining and dining them, meeting them at events or taking them out for dinner, or traveling with them for research purposes. And then with vendors, it's also just another version of a transactional relationship, right? It's usually from a repeat business perspective when you start to develop a type of relationship. And then if you're really comfortable with each other, you can actually offer feedback back and forth with each other without recourse or without fear of like damaging that relationship because you can be honest with each other. But these are primarily B2B relationships. And just over time, I've noticed we don't really consider the participant as part of the relationship building that we're doing as researchers. And if we do, we consider the compensation and the incentives as the driver to that relationship. I don't put methodology here intentionally because the methodology is usually driven by the research need and not from a participant experience perspective. And like I mentioned, I know I'm not the first person to talk about participant experiences, but I'm still seeing a lot of rinse and repeat bad habits that are coming through now that I'm in the role of a recruiter with some of my projects. And before we get any further, I want to remind you that this is 100% scientifically accurate. I have done extensive research to prove that this is the relationship among all of us. Just kidding. This is my observational visual of how I see that participant relationships are usually under-discussed, underdeveloped from a research fieldwork perspective. So how can we do or manage or perform a better relationship with research participants? I'm not inferring a romantic relationship. I am not referring to like an ongoing even a friendship, but there's certain things that I don't think that we have the stamina sometimes as researchers to consider how our opportunities come off very one way, right? Like as researchers, we need you to fit our need. We don't really care if our research fits their need and how it fits into their life and if it's something that they would want to participate or engage in. So respectful research design is first and foremost, I think, something that needs to come back into the conversation. And I had actually some examples of this right before we break into breakout groups from like a respectful perspective. And then I also want you to consider that the invite to the research does not happen at the invite section of the screener that's at the very end, right? The invite to the research is actually the subject line that the panel or database sent out to their panelists to consider joining and signing up for. It's the body message of the email. It's how it's being presented from the panel or the database. In my situation, it's how I'm presenting it on social media, the types of partners that I'm working with, the language that I use. That's really their very first impression and perspective of this type of research project. It's something that I would even want to get into bed with. I also see a very weird sense of tone come through screeners. There's a way to be professional yet personable, and a lot of times our screening writing is very clinical and sterile and cold and doesn't actually infuse like a welcoming environment or why somebody would care to share sometimes about private or sensitive information. And we need to think about how that tone represents the entire research project, right? I think the screening and the qualification happens in its own little bubble over here, and then we try to transition sometimes with another type of tone or personality in the actual research fieldwork. We really need to think from a continuity perspective how all of those things come together under the same umbrella. Follow-ups, I know this sounds really cheesy, but every single person who comes through a research sign-up with a social question, I follow up with them whether they were selected or not selected. I have myself signed up for research opportunities from like a healthcare experience or just being a general consumer. I happen to be on a list to like share more experiences about the purchasing option on this person's website. And then I never hear back from them. I might spend 20 minutes on an online survey trying to qualify for the experience, and I went into the void and nobody came back to me. Just following up with people is not the hardest thing in the world, and it shouldn't be that innovative, but you'd be surprised how many times people get left on red or how many times people sign up for something and then never hear back if they were actually selected. I have a star for rescreening questions. So my next slide, I have a tip for you that you can screenshot. I think confirmation messages, reminder notes, and communication preferences, again, need to be considered all from that holistic like tone and personality perspective. And if you're asking somebody their communication preferences, do that. Otherwise, don't ask for it. I balance between text messages or emails or phone calls or even social media DMs, depending on that individual's outreach style and communication methods. As a millennial, I personally hate answering the phone and doing voicemails, but I work with people in other demographics. They will answer their call. They do prefer a voicemail. They do want just an actual phone call. I also have a unique perspective where I do video calls with everybody. Part of that is driven because I had a hearing disability and I need the closed captioning access as well as being able to see somebody's lips and read their body language, but I know that's not scalable and feasible for everybody, but it's another consideration of like how you're communicating and interacting with your participants before the research fieldwork even starts. I have another pet peeve on scheduling. I'll share on the next slide. Fair compensation. I am tempted, and I feel like out of everybody in this group, Yogesh probably has some information on this already, so I might be sliding into your inbox later. I know that we can't usually share from like a large corporate industry perspective of what the going rates are for certain things, but now that on the recruiter side, I can see what other people are offering, their 60-minute session, their 90-minute session. But I also have the unique advantage of understanding influencers' perspectives of how their time is spent as well, since that's a big audience that I work with. And from a gig economy perspective, people are starting to value their time less from a event perspective and more from an hourly time commitment investment type perspective. And those two things are often at odds with each other when it comes to research budgets and compensation models that we use. Timely compensation, I pay everybody between 24 and 48 hours immediately after their fieldwork session. And I know some people will still wait 15 to 30 days or reconcile their payments, depending on how many activities that they do. And that's such a weird juxtaposition because we don't want professional respondents, but then we're going to combine all of their payments for anything that they did. I have such a hard time with that. We really need to be pushing back on our finance teams to ensure that you have the funding available to compensate somebody immediately. This should be an instant gratification for the research participant, not something that they have to wait 15 to 30 days in an invoiceable amount for. And then I also want you to think about compromises, and this comes through with the rescreening questions that I share next. So 2 tips, this is part A of the 2 tips, so you can wait to screenshot until the next slide. But these 2 questions I add to every screener that have truly helped to balance a relationship type environment with the research participants that are signing up for studies. At the very end of the screener, is there anything else you'd like to share about this topic, or anything that we didn't ask you about that you think might be valuable and interesting to the conversation? You would be incredibly surprised how much sometimes this bumps somebody up into consideration, or it might downgrade somebody from participation in selection, depending on what it is, the extra information that they're sharing. And one of the reasons why I started asking this is organically, using to be a moderator myself, I could start to see in the screener the type of person they wanted to put in the focus group room, the type of person they wanted to interview with. But they tried to question and ask their way to that situation and tried to fit everybody into nice little boxes, which is not feasible considering as humans, we're a lot more expressive than that. So just having an opportunity to gain a little bit more information that the recruiter then can use to not even use as an articulation question, use as a qualification from a whole person perspective. And then I also always save time to find out what questions they had for me, because again, research so far has been very one-sided. How much of this person do we want, or how many of these people do we want in our study? Not does this study fit their needs. And by finding out what questions that they have, a lot of people coming from social media, from my perspective, have never participated in a marketing research course, so they don't know what to expect. They don't know if I'm going to be the same person who's doing the interview. They don't know what kind of platforms they need to have access to. They don't know how compromising it's going to be. The questions are super varied, but giving them an opportunity to begin a level of conversation and dialogue really helps put them in a better frame of mind to want to participate, because they feel like they have a voice or they're being included in the dialogue. Then scheduling, biggest pet peeve of mine. I really, 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 really wish, especially for virtual sessions, you stop asking participants to show up 15 minutes early to a session. Most of our participants are going to also be employed or employees. They know how to work a virtual calendar or schedule. If you're hiring the participant for an 11 a.m. session, they log in at 11 a.m. Add in your check time, your tech check, your hiccups. All of that needs to be considered on the front end of the interview, not prior to the interview. It's nothing more than annoying to people when they get a calendar invite from a scheduler that, okay, my session starts at 11 a.m. Why are you calling me 15 minutes before, wondering where I am or why I'm not there, or things like that. Now, I understand the purpose of that, but put those 15 minutes on the back end of your time that you had reserved and saved, not on the participant schedule, because there's nothing more off-putting than getting urgent messages for something they're not late for to begin with. Those conversations are really frustrating, especially when you're doing a B2B or professional or an expert session topic, because that's an additional 15 minutes that they're going to want to accrue time for or bill you for that we think that we're getting for free. So if nothing else, I really hope that we stop doing that. I can understand from an in-person perspective and needing to go on site for things, but from a virtual perspective, it really is something that shouldn't need to be considered as heavily as it is. All right, 2 examples before we break out into groups for why I think some of these conversations need to happen. I recently completed a project that just kept snowballing in their methodology, and they had a max compensation that they were offering people. It was $600 at most. The screening alone took 30, sometimes 45 minutes with individuals to even see if they qualified for the project. Then there was an immediate, urgent weekend set of activity needs where it was bid for 2 to 3 hours, and more than 50% of the participants mentioned it took over 6, and a handful of people mentioned it took 8 to 10 hours for them to do that. These all need to be employable participants, so they weren't looking for people unemployed. There were a couple of student exceptions, but they had 2 combined 5-hour Zoom mandatory sessions during daytime hours that people had to commit to do both of them for. And then in between the 2 Zoom sessions, there were drawing exercises where specific materials needed to be used. They couldn't use crayons, they couldn't use colored pencils, they had to use markers. They didn't want people to take photos with their phone. They wanted them to do an actual scanning of the document into things. It was so backwards that I'm shocked that people even continued and stayed the course to participate in this. But we also had a lot of people dropping out of the project and deciding not to move forward with their candidacy because $600 just did not match the value perception of what we were asking these people to do. And it was so hard one-sided, not considering that you asked for employable workers and you did daytime 5 hours of Zoom calls for $600, let alone the other activities that happened outside that. It was just such a disconnect between what the research team needed and the real life experience of the research participant. And then for professional expert interviews, I did a bunch of influencer sessions recently. I do not treat any of my B2B or influencer sessions with a compensation model of one size fits all. Instead, I treat my compensation, my incentive money as a budget pool instead, and I allow a little bit of negotiation with the influencers. Sometimes I get diva rates, and those diva rates are obviously not going to be a good fit for the project. Somebody who wants $7,000 to meet for an hour, yeah, no dice, not doing that. But sometimes somebody will value their 2-hour session at $350, and sometimes somebody might want $750. But they're still valuable to have in the conversation. So instead of trying to fit it all into everybody's created equally, allowing that level of negotiating feedback makes the participant feel like they have a valuable voice to the project and going to want to make them show up, because then they don't feel like they've been downgraded or they don't feel like they've been value budgeted for, because we were able to negotiate within the range that they found acceptable. And then from that early sign-on perspective, again, something that I cancel. So you don't have to be best friends with your research participants, but I do want you to consider a positive perception and a reputation that's happening from the recruiter side before the field work even begins. And then for our breakout sessions, I think a good conversation starter would be what areas of the participant experience do you think you need to reconsider that you might not have thought about